Hi, this is Josh Corman, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker, and today we have episode 428 for May 12th, 2025. And we've got an important interview for you today. I kind of set this up last week, and I've been talking about it for a little bit, and it did thankfully come to pass. Josh Corman and I have been trying to get this scheduled for about a month, and he had a very busy schedule, but we made it happen, got it done. We just recorded this actually last Thursday. That's not common for me. Usually kind of record things and then, air them in order. But this one jumped the line, and for a couple reasons. First of all, there are some things coming up that this would be good as a way to kind of let people know that they're coming up. But also, it's really important. We talk a lot on this show about ransomware and data breaches, mass surveillance, and other common privacy and security issues. But today we're going to talk about a danger that arguably dwarfs all of those. And, we should always apportion our attention and resources by answering questions like, how likely is this to happen? And what are the consequences if it does? But when the consequences are sufficiently dire and the probability appears small, like maybe it's never even happened before, or it did and we didn't pay attention to it, the usual formula kind of breaks down. It's kind of like quantum mechanics. Physics works differently at the extreme ends of the scale. There's a famous quote, which, as it often turns out with famous quotes, is that it's believed it was never actually said quite this way, but I think it was at least attributed to this person. General Omar Bradley, a prominent U.S. Army general during World War II, is credited with saying something along the lines of, amateurs talk about strategy and tactics, and professionals talk about logistics and sustainability in warfare. It turns out that infrastructure is very often taken for granted, especially if war has not come to your shore in a really long time. We don't really think about it, but if critical infrastructure fails or is deliberately sabotaged, it can cause really bad things to happen, things that we're often ill prepared to handle, things that are knock-on effects that we didn't think would happen. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the discussion today is a product of threats to the United States specifically, and we'll talk about the impetus for this discussion and what drove Josh to start his latest rather urgent campaign to make things better. But, it's not difficult, nor is it unreasonable, to extrapolate these threats to our NATO allies, for example. But even if you rule out human threats, deliberate threats, the fragility of our infrastructure could also be exposed by natural disasters or, honestly, just a series of unfortunate events. We've seen this happen in the past, and unfortunately, in a lot of cases, I don't think we've really learned from it. So today, we're going to talk about Volt Typhoon specifically and the threat that it poses to the United States and our critical infrastructure, and why it's something that we really, really need to be paying attention to, and what we should be doing about it. And we don't have a lot of time to do it. So I don't want to give too much more away. Well, I'll let Josh explain most of this stuff. But before we do toss around some lingo. And as usual, I want to make sure that I cover some of that ahead of time. So when they come up, if we didn't give it enough context, you can understand what we're talking about. So let me just kind of quickly go through that, and then I want to get to this interview. So we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You may have seen this. It's usually represented as a pyramid chart, where the stuff at the very base is the most fundamental of human needs, all the way up to the top, which are more esoteric and less important in the grand scheme of things. And I think it goes from bottom to top: physiological, in other words, like eating, sleeping, those kind of things; safety, physical safety; love, esteem; and at the very tippy top is what he labeled self-actualization. So the idea kind of being that you need to get the foundations in there first, because if those things aren't addressed, you can't really spend any time worrying on the layer above that. And if you're lucky enough, like most of us are in the Western world, if you've got most of those other things accounted for, then you can spend your time on the more esoteric and would be nice kind of things at the top. But the things we're going to talk about today get at the foundations of these kind of basic human needs. We talk about IT versus OT. You've probably heard of IT, the IT department in information technology. OT, in this case, is operational technology, and it's centered on physical processes and equipment. We talked briefly about the Patch Act, which was great. That's short for Protecting and Transforming Cyber Healthcare. That was a good thing. That was passed in March 2023, and Josh had a hand in getting that to happen. There are some really horrible names for these advanced persistent threats. These cyber adversary groups, usually state-sponsored, and unfortunately, unlike CVEs, the Common Vulnerability Database, we haven't agreed on a single source for naming these things. So everyone has their own names for these things, and that's unfortunately can be very confusing, like it is here, because we have this. We're going to talk today about Volt Typhoon, but then there's also Salt Typhoon. I don't know who named these. I want to say Microsoft, but I'm not sure. It would be really good if we could just decide on a central authority to name these things, so we're at least all talking about the same things. Anyway, we're going to talk about those, and those are specific groups. In this case, I believe both those groups are within China, but they're two totally different cases, and we will actually touch on both of them today, but we're going to focus mostly on the Volt Typhoon threat. We talk about M&A, that's mergers and acquisitions. We talk about an ISAC, that's ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. This was a concept that allowed differing groups to actually have a central hub where they could share information to kind of break down information silos. We talk about tabletop exercises. This is like simulated emergency situations. Somebody comes up with a secret plan for what's going to happen. They bring it in and say, okay, everybody, here's what's going down. How do you respond? And actually walk through it as an exercise. And then finally, he talks about WOPR. That's WOPR. I had to look this up, but it's for War Operation Plan Response. And it's from the movie War Games, which is a classic hacker movie that you should definitely watch at some point. Okay, that's all the setup I'm going to do. Let's get to our interview with Josh Corman. Josh Corman is the founder of I Am the Cavalry, a grassroots organization focused on the intersection of digital security, public safety, and human life. He was formerly chief strategist of CIS's COVID task force, where he advised on the pandemic response, provided cybersecurity expertise on healthcare infrastructure, and supported control systems and life safety initiatives. And now he's part of a new initiative, which we are going to talk about today. Welcome back to the show, Josh.
I'm excited to talk about this.
And me too. It's scary stuff, and I don't like to be hyperbolic or skies falling, but this is the kind of stuff that's life and limb. This is the kind of stuff that needs a kind of attention. So it's good that we talk about it. We probably don't talk about it enough. So here we are. Much of the mainstream media coverage on cyber attacks focuses on monetary losses and data breaches, which, to be fair, are both frequent and substantial. But a lot of your focus has been on critical infrastructure, systems that support our very way of life and whose failure could impact the most fundamental human needs, including life itself. So we're going to talk about today and a new project you've got called Undisruptible 27. So let's start with that. Why did you launch Undisruptible 27 and what is its mission?
Okay, it's hard to define this on its own. I will do my best. I have been on your show before and enjoyed it, so people who have heard it probably don't need as much reminder, but in 2013, I launched imthecavalry.org. The idea of the cavalry isn't coming. No one's going to save us on issues where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. So we were adding software and connectivity to, we were failing left and right on protecting credit card data, person identifiable information, intellectual property. We couldn't secure websites, but here we were putting that same weak digital infrastructure
right
into our cars, our medical devices, etc. And I went high and deep in the federal government and public safety industries, and they just didn't get it yet. So I asked the hackers, instead of lamenting and screaming in the darkness, no one's coming to save us. When no one's coming, it says, all right, what am I willing and able to do? Can I be part of the solution? Can I be what's missing? There's a great origin story there. Some of it's, personal tragedies, etc. But on that arc, that was kind of on top of, in addition, my day jobs. And at certain crisis moments, I might pause my private sector roles like a CTO or CSO type role and then do something for public good. And we started a separate nonprofit called cybermedsummit.org with two physicians. They grew up going to DEF CON and went to medical school. So they were like living, breathing empathy, to be a bridge between what we know and what doctors know. So that was really focused on meeting people where they are in the clinical healthcare world, using their love language, using simulations they do all the time to speak to them, not past or over them, and be a helping hand instead of a pointing finger. So more like a really concentrated version of the I Am the Cavalry approach anyhow. And a series of things, including my CISA COVID task force, trauma and PTSD from trying to keep people alive every day. It wasn't just, it might have started with hospital attacks and supply chains and vaccine work, but it very quickly turned into like attacks on water in Oldsmar, Florida, the oil and gas pipeline shut down for Colonial, the JBS meat facilities getting hacked. And I'm like, look, this is the cavalry's been warning about for years. And when I looked at the federal response and the public-private partnership, they're really not prepared or ready at all for really disruptive attacks further down Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So while you could argue that the cavalry's mission included water, power, access to emergency care, food supply from its get-go, we tended to focus on being patiently impatient and raising the bar for medical devices, passing things like the Patch Act into law, working on IoT, Cybersecurity Improvement Act, generally looking at if these things fail, how do you prevent failure, avoid failure, take help avoiding failure, capture, study, learn from failure, contain and isolate failure, inoculate against future failure. We're trying to push primitives into public policy domestically and globally so that the trust we place in our digital infrastructure is warranted. And it wasn't, and it still isn't.
Yeah.
And arguably we failed. So to your question, we've somehow allowed the 30 years of the cybersecurity industry, and I was just at RSA last week, or the RSAC conference, I think we have to say now, the RSAC. And I was fairly critical of where our priorities have been. But if you zoom out, you would go to that conference every year and think we got things basically under control. But if you look at the news, increasingly, we're the furthest thing from it. My neighbors and my family members are saying, Josh, what the heck's going on? I thought you guys had this. And they're looking at, flights canceled and hospital closures and most of the country being affected by Change Healthcare and delayed integrated care. And they don't see these as hacks or breaches or IOCs or TTPs or, code names for some panda group. They see these as disruptive, right? It's disruptive to patient care, disruptive to cash flow, disruptive to payroll, disruptive to flights. And they're seeing more disruptions, longer disruptions, larger disruptions, more life safety disruptions from accidents like the CrowdStrike attack, failure, it wasn't even an attack, or adversaries that want money. And the trend line just for accidents and monetary adversaries is unsustainable. And yet, if we have to look inward at ourselves and say, we failed you. We allowed you to believe it was generally safe enough to connect your water and wastewater facility to the internet. We can't defend your website, but you're going to put your water and wastewater. So I don't want to be negative about it. We've been trying to do the right thing the right way, being patiently impatient. And while we have made dents and progress, things got worse faster. And I really think this is all about how much we depend on something versus how dependable it is. And I often say we are over-dependent on undependable things, which exposes us to accidents and adversaries. And the stakes are increasing to public safety and national security things. And this was unfortunate prior to last January, which was my trigger point. And now it's, once you add in that these are also weapons of war, and we're likely to have a war very soon, maybe more than one. And we're not ready for that. So I think this project was an extension and a crystallization, and it added an urgency. Whereas if the cavalry was trying to be patiently impatient and say it might take 9 years to pass the Patch Act, which is about what it took, look at Y2K. We knew something bad was coming. We knew it had a deadline. Look at Apollo, the Apollo mission, the capsule. They only have so much oxygen. They only have what's on hand on board. What can you do? And sometimes a crucible or necessity is the mother of invention. And I started saying, we are wildly unprepared for overt, deliberate disruption and destruction of our water facilities as early as 2027. Instead of being powerless, what can be done about it? What do we have time for? Some of this was from the CISA COVID task force, in that we didn't have 10 years to just do zero trust architectures or just do the entire NIST cybersecurity framework. We couldn't do best practices. We instead tried to point people at bad practices. Here's the 3 most dangerous things.
Right, yeah.
We're going to get to some of those later, I think. But you need a level of pragmatism to meet people where they are. And if they don't have a security staff, a security budget, security culture, really it starts with, are you over dependent on undependable things? What are the consequences if you get it wrong? And then how do you manage down the consequences immediately such that you can survive to fight another day and then crawl, walk, run on, more proportional dependence to dependability. Lots of words in there, but I even skipped the heart of the answer, which is there's really like a 1, 2, 3 punch that made me say, okay, it's time to do something much more urgent, much more focused. And some conversations with Craig Newmark, founder of Craigslist, just turned 30 years old, by the way. Not him, the list.
Oh, I was going to say, there's no way he's only 30. Okay.
I met him last February, and he didn't know about the cavalry, but was really taken with what we had done with no money, no support on, deliberately took no money. And he wanted to do something in that vein. And I wanted to maintain the cavalry doesn't take money. It's all volunteers. Wanted independence, no strings on us. So we found a way to fund a pilot through IST, the Institute for Security and Technology, famous for the ransomware task force work. And we said, look, the cavalry might be a fast friend and a partner, but I can't volunteer anybody. CyberMed Summit has some hints and blueprints at how you talk to stakeholder-specific industries that we could maybe accelerate and replicate for water and power and food supply. But let's see if a concerted effort full-time could try a different approach and be more successful in the first 30 years of hand waving. So I still didn't quite give you what those 3 triggers were, but there's my initial answer.
All right, so Undisruptible 27 has 27 right in the name. And
right.
It's, I think one of the things you're going to talk about is the China's rumored 2027 timeline for potential Taiwan invasion. I know that was part of where this came from. So what's the strategic logic behind pre-positioning malware in U.S. infrastructure as part of that preparation? Like what do we think the end game is for China? Are they trying to deter us from intervening at all? Or are they trying to paralyze us during a combat? What do we know about that, and why was that an impetus for what you're doing?
So to ask them why they're doing it, you'd have to ask them. But what we can extrapolate from their public comments and from the January 31st, 2024 hearing with the 4 horsemen of cyber policy, in an unclassified setting, we talked about, we revealed Volt Typhoon to the world. There's lots of typhoons you might have heard of. They are not created equal. The naming is counterproductive and unfortunate.
And I get them mixed up, yeah.
Salt is the one that gets more attention because it's an incredibly embarrassing degree of spycraft on spycraft, but it's still within norms. That's the compromise of all the telcos and carriers and still there, still can't get evicted. But that is within the norms of what it's fair play for countries doing espionage. Private sector pre-positioning malware, what Volt Typhoon is we have found a military group of China campaign, the PLA, People's Liberation Army, in U.S. water facilities and other lifeline critical infrastructure in what they call pre-positioning. And the idea here is Xi Jinping intends to take Taiwan as early as 2027. Obviously, paying attention to what happened with Russia and Ukraine has tempered the timing, but so some people think it'll be later than 2027. There's some countrywide anniversary that has just arrived that would make this a meaningful time to do this. And specific for Xi Jinping, this is very personal for cementing legacy. So there will be an attempt. And the question is the timing, and there's some race conditions like, is it a blockade before we can get in a position, in which case, watch Star Wars Episode 1 for blockades, where it would be much harder to unseat. So there might not be a lot of shooting for this war, but it could also be more protracted. But it's going to happen. They're going to try. So timing is up to the experts, and I don't think anyone knows, and windows of opportunity create themselves, but we know he's targeting 27 plus or minus. Some people have some very specific reasons why they specifically know the approximate date, but we can't ignore that that's pretty friggin' close.
Yeah.
Number 2, the logic is if the U.S. interferes, we'll rain chaos on your infrastructure. So I'll get to your specific question in a second. But if you're in your left hand is, if you interfere, we're going to rain chaos on your brittle water infrastructure, plus. And my right hand is, we have to interfere. We have no choice but to interfere. So if you do X, I'm going to punch you. We're going to do X, they're going to punch us. And when they punch us, they're going to knock us on our ass. Our least guarded, least resilient infrastructure is water. And I'm picking on water a lot during this. It's not a water only project, which some people have mistaken it for. It's that when I did my analysis of these lifelines, which ones are the best prepared, have the most fail-safe, fallback alternatives like generators for power. Like, it's the least effective public-private partnership with the least amount of reach to owners and operators, with the least functioning public-private partnership, with the no mandatory minimums. There's a lot of reasons why water is important just at face value, but when you look at the interdependence of things, no water means no hospital in about 4 to 6 hours. And we could break down specifically what breaks first, second, third from doing this empathy driven, meeting people where they are. They're teaching us what fails first, second, third. So Volt Typhoon being revealed there, whether it's 2027 or earlier with Iran, given some of the unpleasantness we've had there, or if things go wrong with Russia, any one of our countries we can have a conflict with, it'll be a hybrid conflict. The next conflict will be a hybrid conflict. We live in glass houses. If people start throwing rocks, we're going to have some shattered glass. So this is something in our privately owned and operated infrastructure is not factored into the math. It's not insured or insurable. There's a whole bunch of things we are just not ready for in any way, shape, or form. And I felt like, look, if we're going to get hit by a typhoon or a hurricane or a natural disaster, we should probably warn people it's coming. They should not be blindsided. And it's not that you can't do anything. I mean, like I said, during the Cystic COVID task force, we didn't have 3 years. We had 3 months, 6 months. And we figured out there's some things you can do that can materially buy down risk. They may not be elegant. They may not be your long-standing solution. But there are choices one can make to reduce the harm.
Right. I mean, like looking at Apollo 13, they had what they had, and they had a limited amount of time and resources, and they figured something out. Yeah. And so, that's kind of what you're talking about. I think that what also people might be underestimating is the psychological and the sociological aspects of these kind of attacks. If you're deprived of basic needs, it doesn't take too long before we get real lower to the flies, right?
Right. Well, bridging your last question to this one, I'm not in their head, but the way I think about China's intentions here with the water and the campaign, they've already done one thing, which is they've told the U.S. we have virtual bombs in your water plants that we could detonate anytime we want. So they haven't really told the public yet, but they have told, our government. So there is a deterrence of stay out of our fight, right? I also think there could be on the escalatory ladder a brushback pitch, to use a sports ball metaphor that were we to encroach or cross a red line of intervention, they may give us a demonstration of capability to put us on our heels and say, think twice, because ultimately I believe the objective of this campaign is to undermine public support for our intervention, because it's hard to do something overseas when your public doesn't support you. But number 3 is it could be all out chaos, which would absolutely focus our energies internally on citizen support, but also citizen stabilization. And if you talk to Mark Montgomery and some of the others tracking Volt Typhoon in a different way, they're looking at the lifeline, not just the lifeline critical infrastructure like I am, but the pieces of critical infrastructure that enabled the projection of power and movement of equipment and troops and railroads and ports and airstrips that could allow us to make our campaign successful. So the projection of force and public confidence and public support for intervention are really in play here for this one. So it could be anything on that ladder from it's just sitting there like assorted Damocles, which is incredibly like the objective of terrorism is terror. It's to make you scared. And it's already sort of done that. I think certain policymakers disagree on the impact of these attacks. They like, well, if it's only a couple facilities, like, as long as it's not in their other person's town, they won't care. And I said, I think you're looking at there's a what is it? HEMP, I think is the acronym. There's a human cost, an economic cost. I think M is mission cost, but P is psychological cost. And I think even 1 or 2 cities being without water or hospitals on U.S. soil would have a similar psychological effect to 9/11. Just a couple planes hitting a couple towers and the Pentagon. Look, we went to war for 20 years and compromised civil liberties. Look at how galvanizing Pearl Harbor was just in one of the 50 states. I don't think we're in a mood to have that level. We're just not ready culturally to have weapons of war used on U.S. soil on non-combatant citizens. And that's really what is going on here. These aren't military targets. They're not legitimate military targets. These are civilian infrastructure affecting non-combatants, and it's really transgressive and counter-normative. So when I said to you that Salt Typhoon is spy on each other all the time, it's fair play. And Salt is absolutely, it's different in degree, but not in type or norm. Volt Typhoon is different. It's counter-normative. It's not a line we should allow to be crossed, and currently it has been crossed, and we haven't stabilized on an international response to that.
And so, just to be clear, I mean, we're not even just talking about disabling systems. Like, we're not talking about, we got to reboot the computers, or we got to reinstall the hard drives. We're talking about potentially destroying systems. Like, recovering from attack won't necessarily be as simple as doing those things. Like, we actually ran a test. This is a famous one in cybersecurity in 2007, where we actually showed that we could blow up, like physically destroy a generator with a cyber attack. And Stuxnet was kind of the same thing, right? It was a software that was designed to ruin the nuclear centrifuges by making them, spin too fast and report that they weren't. I know you've talked about, I think, putting a spike of water pressure on our pipes that are fragile and bursting pipes. I mean, you don't just fix that in a day and keep moving, right? This is more than just maybe what we thought of in the past about some of these attacks.
Yeah, the first DHS people I went to when I launched in the cavalry, they used the term cyber physical systems, and they said every word matters, right? These are cyber origination, but with a physical consequence, and they're often not, you're attacking a device, you're attacking a system or a system of systems. And complex systems fail in complex ways. And these are, I think a lot of people that know Volt Typhoon exists think it's going to be a ransomware or a defacement. Like, oh, we're just going to lock it up and you can restore from your backup images. No. Right. No. That's not the intention here. The intention is to undermine public support for our intervention. And how do you do that? You break stuff. And it could just be breaking the equipment so it doesn't work. A lot of these modern Emerson or other devices in the water facilities don't even have a wheel that a human can turn. It's just a computer. So there's no manual alternative.
To be clear, there used to be a wheel. And they took it off.
And not only are they standalone, maybe without manual interventions, they're also hyper connected to some cloud to do predictive maintenance or AI or pressure adjustments. So these things, it's hard to have physical manual, and the pandemic made it worse because of sickness and death and migration. A lot of the talent pool that could operate these and work from home stuff forced more connectivity, more downsizing, and that's only going to continue. So when we talk about impact, what we're really looking at is a skilled professional engineer that's ethical, that's operating these plants, knows that they could do some harm, but they're not motivated to do harm. They put in as many checks and procedures as possible to prevent harm, but no one ever gets the budget that they need. So what you have is something that can be safely operated by a responsible, ethical engineer or plant operator that's now connected to every accident and adversary with every motive. So we talked to these engineers through this project, and we found we rank ordered the worst case scenario. What's your nightmare, or what's the most damage you could do? It tended to be one of three things, but I tend to focus on the water hammer. So water hammer, you probably heard in your own home. It might sound like a little ball peen hammer on a little pipe, but they can be quite forceful and destructive. A burst water main of a 12 or 24 inch or 36 inch water main will be like a 50-foot geyser into the sky. And you don't get to choose where it bursts. It's going to burst somewhere. It's going to destroy the road, erode the side. Maybe you can fix it quickly. Maybe you can't. Depends on where it breaks and how brittle the pipes are elsewhere. And the next one will just hit the next weakest link. So we have some aging pipe infrastructure. So a water hammer is something that they know how to not do accidentally. But if someone wanted to deliberately do it, it could be pretty devastating. With 151,000 water facilities, they wouldn't have to be successful at hitting all of them. They just have to be successful at hitting enough of them to make their point. I would say even 2 would be enough. The second thing is called overpressurization, where you just turn the pressure up too high and you can cause cracks. And underpressurization was the third one. It's not much safer than overpressurization. So I think the worst case scenario is out of the 151,000 facilities we have, 6,000 of them are supporting a hospital. And the pressure zone for the hospital should be where we focus our defensive energy on. Can we make sure that a compromised water facility that throws a water hammer cannot burst the water main for the pressure zone serving the hospital? If we can do that, I'm going to feel pretty successful. A burst water main is fixable. Some of them are even fixable quickly, but not when they're concurrently across every, water facility in the U.S., with some portion succeeding and failing, and not when you have to prioritize which ones do you fix first, second, third. And often counties will share third-party contractors and heavy equipment to do the repair. And then what do? You rob Peter to pay Paul? Do you fix your town or the town next door because they have a trauma center? So, we're talking, this isn't about backup and restoration or paying a ransom or restoring to factory defaults. This is, we often do we say that prevention is impossible. You want fast recovery and response. That's fine when it's, IT. When it's OT, what's the fast recovery and response for a burst water main?
Well, and as we've seen, even with the California fires, sometimes it's not, if it's a localized thing, we can swarm resources from other places to take care of that. If it's widely distributed, we won't be able to handle that in the same way.
Yeah, my RSA talk had an objection handling session. I framed it like war games, like Joshua, because my name is Joshua. So it looked like Whopper, and in it, one of the sections was on, combating the top 5 responses. And one of them is, well, wouldn't we just use mutual assistance, mutual aid, like we did for the wildfires or for hurricanes? And it's an interesting instinct, right? The problem is when it's everything everywhere all at once, the concurrency is where we call it the fallacy of mutual assistance, because most states can only handle like 1 to 3 crises at a time. And this is going to be pretty much any town everywhere. So there's going to have to be some left to boom triage and prioritization of, do you do the trauma centers before the normal hospitals, the hospitals before the dialysis clinics? Are dialysis patients going to live? Probably not. So some of those hard triage discussions have to happen early. You can go, what was it the Gulas told me? You can go 3 minutes without breathing, 3 days without water, 30 days without food. So some of this is just kind of looking at what's the downtime tolerance, what's the consequences of delay, how do you choose which things to fortify left a boom and which things to respond to right a boom, and ethical, equitable triage should probably happen before we're in live fire, then left a boom versus right a boom. To your Lord of the Flies point, whether it's the hurricanes in Puerto Rico or some of the wildfire stuff or Rodney King riots, we know that we're about 48 hours from civil unrest if the public doesn't trust the government to govern and protect them. So maybe it's a little longer, but in these hyper elevated circumstances we find ourselves in, I'd rather not find out how many days tolerance we have. Right. I'd like to make sure that we have personal resilience, which I think we're going to get to at some point, and at least local resilience, and then we can focus our crisis management response on the things that can't be done by individuals or small communities.
I watched that congressional testimony, not all of it. I think it was like 3 hours long, but I certainly watched all the opening statements, and I've seen some of the clips, and it was sobering. And honestly, it seems like it should have been, a Y2K or a Sputnik level event, right? Like if it seemed like a really dire threat, and yet I haven't seen a moonshot level response. So why isn't it all over the news? Why are we talking about this? Why haven't we, like we had with COVID, like we did with Y2K, that we had a chance to see coming? Well, we didn't see COVID coming, I guess, but I'm sure we did have some pandemic plans, at least on the books. We successfully mobilized against those threats. Why hasn't there been a similar response to this threat?
There's no single answer, but it is stunning to me as well. Like when I saw that hearing, I'm like, okay, they're saying the quiet part out loud. Let's go. It's time to go. Mm-hmm. And then I just didn't see the plans coming. I think some of it was we went into campaign seasons. Some of it was there were so many typhoons, people couldn't tell them apart. You even admitted yourself we can't tell them apart. Yeah. I think there's a part of the human brain that when they hear something scary, we push it away. Mm-hmm. FUD has been abused. Fear, uncertainty, doubt has been abused a lot by this industry and by governments to cause false urgency. Sometimes, though, like there really is a wolf when you cry wolf. And we're so numb to this. I think if this had been announced and shared prior to the pandemic, and I'm not saying it's exclusively the pandemic's fault, but I think we may have seen a different result. But we've been inured to the suck on things like solar winds, on things like the pandemic response, but probably more importantly and closer to my my trauma is like we saw the erosion of institutional trust in media and institutional trust in government and institutional trust of science. Like everybody was kind of acting poorly, irrespective of political stripes, and people don't know what to believe anymore. So when you hear something bad is happening, we have become inured or numb to it. I think people's personal sphere of empathy for others has retracted throughout the pandemic. Isolation and post-pandemic and cynicism has gone up. There's a number of issues, and you could spend an entire episode on that, maybe should.
But like, what about within the government though? Those people are career officials that are trained to look past that and to plan anyway. Yeah,
and people might get frustrated with my remarks here, but like I think each one of the four of them said really clear things. So in the NSA, on the NSA side, he was outbound, heading to Vanderbilt. So his comments were on point, but he wasn't going to carry forth the mission beyond that. So I think we should ask his successor more, who's now been ousted.
Right.
Harry Coker was fairly new to ONCD. His comments were good, but I think he was still trying to figure out how to move this brand new department forward within the White House. And Christopher Wray was probably the clearest and had the most sound bites. There's only so much the FBI can do. They're law enforcement. They find and create evidence and prosecute people.
Right.
Jen initially is the most surprising and in some ways disappointing on this, because I think the words were quite on point. I think the urgency sounded to be there, but then to watch where efforts and time was spent, like there were music, jingles and whatnot for MFA and cell phone security and update things, which are eventually important, but there was no song for water. So some of the programs under Jen's remaining time at CISO did in fact prioritize water in schools and some of the critical infrastructure, for sure, the target rich cyber poor, as we like to call them. But I expected it to play a much stronger role. But then, as I said, the election security came up and everything became, all the public optics became about either elections or personal security. So, the four of them said the right types of things. The follow through seemed to be missing.
We've talked a lot about China, and you did bring up Iran, but, Russia, North Korea, there are other people out there who seek to do similar kind of harm. Do they pose a similar threat? I mean, I know that we talked very specifically about China wanting to kind of, do the brush bat pitch in case they want to go to Taiwan. But do those other adversaries pose a similar threat, or at least a similar response?
Well, I have two ways I answer this. Let's say three. One, whether you're paying attention to this or not, Iran has in fact attacked U.S. water facilities. After the unpleasantness between Israel and Gaza, the Cyber Avengers, a hacktivist group in Iran, did attack and deface the interfaces of Unitronics devices in Pennsylvania and a few other states, basically chastising anyone for using Israeli equipment. So that defacement could have been a payload to brick the equipment, or it could have been to manipulate the controls on that equipment. So if you can reach out and touch someone for defacement, you have this sufficient level of access to do more harm. So I think that too was a demonstration of access and capability from Iran. The Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, CARR, it's a criminal group, but they did in fact, I think Wired Magazine covered this, as did others. They did in fact attack facilities in Texas and cause two big water tanks to overflow. So they can reach out and touch someone with physical effect. Malicious intent is not a prerequisite to harm, so a ransom crew could easily do harm by accident.
Right.
Because maybe it's not turning up the pressure. Maybe it's like disabling device allows the pressure to reach unstable levels, and the harm happens whether you intended it or not. So I would say that we have three of the four major superpowers we might have a war with have already demonstrated they can compromise our equipment. And number two, I'd prefer not to have a situation where we're kind of hoping our predators don't attack us. Like, can't we do things to make sure that they can't hurt us versus hope they don't hurt us? It's not a great sustainable thing. Look at how much effort we put into physical Department of Defense for air, for sea, for space, even to keep our citizens safe. But we're then going to allow the thermal exhaust port on all of our water, our most precious resource, to be exposed to any accident adversary at any time, and just say tough luck, fend for yourself against a Chinese military group. No, I think it's stunning to me I think part of this is the security industry allowed us to believe it was safe enough to do these things. Part of it is the U.S. decided to privatize it's like 85% of critical infrastructure and lifeline critical infrastructure is privately owned and operated. So we've delegated it to the private sector to defend themselves. We have cyber command for offense outside the border of the country, but we don't have a cyber equivalent for defense for the homeland. So we're just, it's a perfect storm of the cybersecurity industry projecting too much overconfidence, the government delegating too much to privatization, our anti-regulatory or deregulatory, there's a whole bunch of things that kept us unsafe. And then unfortunately, the current administration and the natural rhythms of too much government, not enough government, where we are right now, we're actually weakening the institutions we did have at a time when we need them most. And there's pretty bipartisan support. I think we're going to get to this later as well, but there's pretty bipartisan support that China's a big threat here, that Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon are pretty bad, that we need to do things about them. And a lot of these harms to our readiness aren't deliberate. They're really unfortunate. Some of them are unforced accidents that they're trying to walk back. And other ones, it's just, we haven't yet figured out the steady state balance between the federal government and the states. We haven't figured out the steady state balance between public and private partnership. We haven't figured out the steady state balance between parts of the government, who's responsible for what. And yet it's game time before we're ready.
So we talked about Change Healthcare briefly. That impacted, I read, 94% of U.S. hospitals.
I had heard 75%, but it's still, no matter what it is, it's pretty bad.
Way too big.
Yeah.
And there are other key companies that make products and provide services that support many key infrastructure firms. So how do we service these single sources of failure before they're compromised? We had same thing with CrowdStrike and SolarWinds. We seem to be shocked that when these things went bad, these affect a lot of things. There's ripple effects.
Yeah, I have a couple of responses to change, because the three things that made me say let's do Undisruptible was, one, the public revelation of Volt Typhoon. Two, meeting Craig at an event called Common Good Cyber, which probably won't tell that story, but I was frustrated at the lack of urgency and systems thinking from most of the nonprofits in this space. And we were sharing some notes about what impact looks like and needs to look like. And then third, on the last day of that gathering, was Change Healthcare. And it was a textbook example of what we called sicky. And I'm like, for goodness sake, where are the adults? Where's the urgency? Where's the systems thinking? Where's the prioritization?
And for the audience, what does sicky stand for?
Sicky, I'll do that now, I guess. Sicky is a concept in critical infrastructure. It was piloted in the financial services sector unpopularly with this thing called Section 9. But the idea is that when everything's critical, nothing's critical. So each of the sectors of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors should know what their sickies are, which is systemically important critical infrastructure. You may also heard the term that Jenny's truly preferred, which was systemically important entity, or SIE. I just look at it as a systemically important critical infrastructure is something that if you shut it off, really outsized bad things happen. And a systemically important entity is a named member of SICI.
Okay.
It could be as little as 6 players in a space could have an outsized impact. It could be 60. You shouldn't preordain how many there are, but it's areas of concentration of risk. So when the first Change Healthcare stuff happened, I talked to Sean Lingus at CNN and I said, look, if we don't proactively identify our systemically important entities, our adversaries will continue to reveal them for us while we burn. They're going to get found. The question is, do you find them and fortify them or mitigate them? Or do you wait until they're on fire and you have 75% or 94% with your number of U.S. healthcare and pharmacies, brought to their knees for weeks and months for cash flow?
Is there a tabletop exercise? Is there a standard approach to finding these things and surfacing them so that we can see them? Make them show themselves?
It was a concept. Yeah, it was a concept floated from the National Risk Management Center, NRMC, within CISA, even before it was called CISA. The guy that coined the term and was pushing it waited for demand signal from leadership, and I kept pushing back. I'm like, isn't there such a thing as supply signal? Aren't we supposed to lead? It was unpopular with the industry because no one wants to be on that list. And it was also unpopular because it starts to reveal market concentration and monopolies that they kind of like and had lobbied their way around with silly terms like vertical integration. Change Healthcare happened against antitrust lawsuits, and people tried to stop his M&A for the mega giant of United Health Group and its subsidiaries, of which Change Healthcare is one. And, I think one of the phrases I used is,
unsound market consolidation drives unsound risk and concentration. I actually had that quote in my notes.
What is it again? I always trip over my memory.
Unsound market consolidation drives unsound risk concentration.
I think it was unmitigated. What I meant to say was unmitigated market concentration, or otherwise, healthy market concentration drives unsound risk concentration. Yeah. More eggs in fewer baskets is the way I talked to my neighbor about it. The idea with SICI was, if you look at global banking, there's a handful of companies you've never heard of that if any one of them stops, like global trade stops. So the Section 9 list was coming up with what are they? They didn't really have a methodology, in part because they didn't want to make it a methodology. So you're asking why it wasn't done more proactively. A lot of it was lobbying groups said, we don't want this. But what I did during the pandemic is we had 1,000, I think I talked about this on the last episode we did, but I had 1,000 vaccine supply chain support, like somewhere down the supply chain, who touches the vaccines or diagnostics, the therapeutics. And they said, can you prioritize these? And we made it a 4,000 entity list within a week. And then we got it down to 66. We had a pretty obvious methodology, brain dead battlefield triage methodology of how many people depend on it, how consequential would failure be. So dependency graphs and weightings and things like, and scarcity was a really big one. Like, are there alternative technology platforms and alternatives within them, or is this a sole source with no alternative? And by the way, I'm using this methodology a lot and Undisruptible, but we, in less than 2 weeks, had 66 ranked, prioritized SICIs essentially for Operation Warp Speed. They could and should have replicated that, and they were reluctant to do so because it involved working with other U.S. agencies, other U.S. sector leadership, and lobbying groups. So the reason Change Healthcare made me mad is that was an entirely preventable and avoidable thing. And I think everyone knew for healthcare, Epic, like the electronic medical records, is a common mode failure. It's a near monopoly. It's when they go down, everything goes down. And we know we have them, but I didn't know what Change Healthcare was until things went down. So to your point about tabletops, it's a pretty easy question that even CISOs do sometimes, where they're trying to get rid of legacy tech, is you start to ask, if we shut this off, who would scream? Right. And you can, with the right kind of questions, without even having to do a live fire exercise, you can find out the most dependent upon things. And when they come down to one or two monopoly players, like when you're looking at, someone approving or disapproving an acquisition, like you can try to factor in not just economic concentration, but systemically important critical infrastructure functionality, right? You can try to say this is too big. Remember when we had one Bells family and we made the mama Bells and we broke out the baby Bells?
Yeah.
Like there are times and a place to have segmentation and isolation. Irish potato famine, monocultures are bad. So we want some biodiversity. We don't want chaos. We want biodiversity to ensure that you don't lose all of your national capacity for something. And we have plenty of SICI that everybody knows. And what you really want to do is have your initial hypothesis list that everybody knows. And then you want to have a robust way to rerun that analysis on an interval, or respond quickly when you have a surprise, like a Change Healthcare. Say, what in our rubric did we miss? How do we improve the rubric going forward? And the goal would be, not to just have a list that you admire, but to say, we know that if these things go down, it's going to have a bigger impact. Out of the 151,000 water facilities I mentioned to you, there's 650 of them are in the ISAC. That's 0.4% even show up to talk cyber. 0.4%. That's not a functioning public-private partnership. It's not the ISAC's fault. But what do? I can scream about it and whine about it. But what I suggested is, let's target the 6,000 communities that house a hospital. And to me, that's a risk analysis of all water is important to citizens to drink, but there might be wells, there might be bottled water, there might be life straws and filtration, but the hospital cannot function without water. So you want to do simple, lightweight, common sense triage to at least identify the first tier of SICI.
All right. So looking at this other way, what is the likelihood, in your estimation, I'm sure you don't know, that the U.S. government and our allies have similar capabilities to attack the infrastructure of our adversaries? Is there, like with the nuclear, back in the Cold War, there's this notion of mutually assured destruction, and it was a strategic deterrence.
Yeah.
And it was published, like it was well known, like you've got this, I've got this, you don't move, we don't move. Is there any kind of that same calculus here? What do we know about that?
Yeah, this comes up almost every time I talk about this with anybody for more than 10 minutes. Like, oh, I assume we can knock them down too. Mm-hmm. The first thing I'll say is when I was going into the forts and everything, briefing people on Anonymous during the rise of Anonymous and hacktivism and things, one of the questions I had the first time I went to Fort Meade was, hey, what does the hacker community think of our capabilities here? And the answer I gave at the time was almost verbatim what I would say now. And I said, well, I assume we're really, really good at offense. I assume we're really, really bad at defense. We probably take solace in the assumption that the same is true for our adversaries. But we forget that as the most connected nation, we have much, much more to lose. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple things you could look at. Assume for a moment that we're as good or better at offense and throwing punches than our enemies. Most of our enemies are not as over-dependent on Connect technology as we are. So that's a key difference maker. Number two, we tend to be more morally constrained than a lot of our adversaries. Number three, some of our adversaries don't care about their people. In fact, persecute and kill some of their people. And number four, most of these state actors have state-run infrastructure. So when they have to make a change or a segmentation and isolation problem, they have the span and sphere of control with which to do so. So it doesn't mean that we couldn't throw punches. We're just less likely to do so. We consider it counter-normative for the global order to attack non-combatant civilian infrastructure deliberately. So could we do it? Probably. Do we do it? No. And if we were to, it would have a cost in the global stage and our standing, just like other things are eroding some of that standing. So could we throw the punch? Sure. But I'm going to flip it on you and say, will you feel better when your family has already been hurt that we can punch them back? Well, it might make you temporarily feel better, but your family's still hurt. Your community's still hurt. I think the reason that nuclear deterrence worked is the world was in awe and in shock of a mushroom cloud and a demonstration of capability. There's no deterrent effect on the U.S. civilians right now because nobody can imagine this could happen. And no one has seen it happen yet. So I think we're going to have, what do they say? Public policy is always written in blood. I think we're going to have some pretty high cost in order to learn the lesson of like what MAD looks like in cyber. But generally speaking, most of us that have been doing cyber policy and cyber statecraft don't believe deterrence works nearly as well in cyber as it does in any other domain. There's still a debate on does deterrence work at all or what does deterrence look like. So whether you're a scholar or not, I would just put it as simply as, do we want to have taken a whooping before we, start to hit back? And we're certainly not going to proactively be the first one to strike here.
No.
So I yes, it comes up. I'm sure we could throw a punch if we had to. We tend to try to adhere to international law of conflict. In fact, one of the cool talks we're going to host at Critical Effect is an international Red Cross lawyer. And one of his warnings to us is we should be very, very clear to delineate what is support of warfighting bases and equipment so that you don't have civilian infrastructure marked as a legitimate target for conflict. So if a water facility, for example, services a base, it could be considered a legitimate military target, even if it's also services civilians. So the international policy and war community, whether we believe those institutions and norms will hold up or not, currently would dissuade us from doing the kind of things that our adversaries seem quite willing to do to us. That's why I said it's so counter-normative to have these virtual bombs in civilian non-combatant infrastructure.
All right. Well, I want to take the rest of our time to talk about what we can do about this and maybe what we should be doing about this. So I think there's lots of potential players there and lots of potential people who could help. So let's start with, let's start with the people usually go to, the government, right? That's usually what we lean on them for things like this. So according to your website, we have something like 600 days. What should we be doing at time frame?
Yeah.
and local, state, and federal government. Let's start with them. What are they doing? What should they be doing?
So at the 50,000 foot level, when I started this project, we didn't know who was going to win the election. So irrespective of outcome of election, I set expectations that the federal government, while mighty, moves slowly. And for the time horizon for which we're going to have a brand new Congress, we're going to have a brand new White House, we're going to have brand new political appointees. We should not expect very much from the federal government. So existing services I expected to continue, but a lot of the burden here was going to shift to state and local. So as such, this initiative is really looking at meeting people where they are in urban, suburban, and rural facilities, especially the target-rich cyber poor that are not participating in public-private partnerships. So that means we have to get down on the ground and meet with people to see what their expectations, their belief sets are, et cetera. And we're going to use two styles to get to them that had not really been used by public-private partnerships. One was we're going to treat this like emergency management and natural disasters like FEMA. Mm-hmm. So when the hurricane's coming, you don't say, well, you can't do anything about it, so we're not going to bother telling you. No, hell no. They have a right to know. So Tom Bossert was famous for saying inform, influence, inspire for hurricanes. He was National Security Advisor for Homeland. And the idea is you tell them what you know, tell them what you don't know. The more consequential something is, the more forthright you have to be. Don't pull any punches and don't exaggerate, right? Then you want to influence their behavior in some way. Like, this is the safest thing you can do. The less, if you can't do that, here's what else you could do. And then you want to inspire that if we continue to work together and update each other, we're going to be okay, right? As long as that's honest. So that inform, inspire, influence loop and how FEMA and state level emergency preparedness response people do stuff is something we have not really tapped into for cybersecurity much. So we're going to try that. But also we have to do creative arts. We have to A/B test and try different love languages. And there's a lot of fish out there. So you need a lot of lore for different fish. And that means you don't use jargon from the cybersecurity industry. You don't talk over them and past them. You don't assume that they could just buy, some best practices kit at RSA. They probably can't buy anything. So that means empathy and exploration and trying A/B testing. So we've been using some creative arts budget to make creative arts videos, some of which I debuted in my talk at RSAC last week. And in phase 2, we're really going to ramp that up because they've been pretty successful. That's how we learned the water hammer was more important. That's how we learned it's likely to be a physical mitigation, an engineering down risk, not a cybering up. It's not shields up, it's connections down or adding physical countermeasures. So some combination of disaster preparedness, science, and communications with it, and creative arts communications have been a pretty big difference maker here. It's daunting because there's 151,000 water facilities, but it's also, if you apply some of that risk management stratification of the hospitals, and all we have to do is give them that spark that says this is a bad scenario. Once we have that attention, we've warned them of what's coming, we've enabled and empowered them to do something about it, then they can say, okay, what else could go wrong? So you kind of give them their first taste on something that can command their attention and can be acted upon. I also think your permission to say something scary is proportional to how much you empower and enable someone to do something about it. And we can't always give them an easy out, but we're asking a lot of them for their attention, but we're also working with a few of them to pilot and stress test what are some viable mitigations that we've already seen work. So we've been doing them quietly up until now. We're going to do some more overtly and start doing maybe even a long form podcast with some of the pilots and start publishing success stories. And some will be red states and some will be blue states and some will be well funded and some will be really underfunded. And some will have a security team, but most will not. And we're going to capture what didn't work to buy down risk and start sharing that. So this could be the gateway drug for other things from other initiatives that can then layer in cyber afterwards. But I want to make sure that no one's surprised. I want to keep the water pressure zone for the hospitals up and running. And then from that catalyst, then we could crawl, walk, run on better right sizing over dependence on more dependable things with eyes wide open.
So you already said that like 85% of the critical infrastructure is owned by private companies, and private companies today are not incentivized to do security and resilience. The market rewards speed and innovation, and let's face it, profit.
Yeah.
So how do we get them to spend time and money on this, especially when they've got to take it to the boards and the shareholders?
It's even worse than what you've said because a lot of these are price fixed. So some water facilities it costs them $1.25 to deliver $1 water. Like they lose money on everything. They're not allowed to raise prices, and cyber was never part of the math. So some of those restrictions are actively harmful and aren't going to get fixed quickly. So I was talking to Nick Liserson, famously of Langevin and the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, but also helped found the Office of National Cyber Director and worked there as one of his first hires. I was talking about this, and he thought that my theory of the case could work but not in the time frame we talked about. And his answer is, you thought they were missing the information, but they're also missing motivation and enablement. So this phase 2 proposal we have in front of Craig and others is trying to, if we already started to close the information awareness gap, we now need to close the motivation and enablement gap. And that's where we really want to capture, curate, and distribute. We want to innovate narrowly and then replicate widely to show them that it's a really scary thing and it's a really easy fix for now. You're going to have to do more later. But, with this, the fix against a water hammer, for example, can be as little as $2,000. So this isn't like $20 million of cybersecurity kit from RSA and hiring a team of 10 people and threat hunters. This is a $2,000 investment of a pressure sensor arrestor or similar known fixes for things like overpressurization or underpressurization. They are more likely to do something like that because they know the cost of a ruptured water main is, outside their annual budget if they're going to have this many happen, right? Yeah. So I don't know which lure will work for which fish, and we don't think it's going to be the same from town to town. But if we capture enough of them, then we hope to reach more of them. So yes, it is not as simple as telling them something they didn't know. And we're not under the illusion that every single one of these are going to act upon the opportunity. But I kind of figured one or two more towns that don't have their hospital go down is kind of a win.
Yeah.
Yeah. I prefer to make sure none of the 6,000 hospitals. Yeah. And if we're on a good footing, we can actually project power back to our adversaries and say, go ahead and try to throw a punch. We can take it. We've looked at the worst case scenario. It isn't going to work. And not only is it not going to work, you're going to be caught red-handed trying to attack non-combatant civilians. And it won't achieve your objective. So do you really want to throw that punch? So there's a couple different layers to this on the, optics for adversaries, optics for our citizens, optics for our government. And it's worthwhile enough to at least tell people the very real possibilities near. There are things you can do about it. And then while we're at it, let's start to teach you other things you can do to have safer embrace of hyperconnectivity.
All right. So last question, and maybe the most important one from this audience, and because I don't know how many people in my audience own and run critical infrastructure companies, but as regular people, consumers, citizens, are there things that we can and should be doing to make ourselves more resilient and prepared? Can we better our position ourselves to help our, not only ourselves, but maybe our community, in the face of critical infrastructure, even to the point of not being a burden to first responders when stuff goes sideways, letting them focus on the people that are maybe, you don't get at.
Yeah, I think it's going to sound paradoxical, but I think we should encourage you to be very selfish about your household and your dependent care. It's very difficult to help your community if you're worried about your own household. So we start on the recommendations from my RSAC talk. We say, what can you do? It starts at home. What can you do to make sure your household has enough water or shelf-stable food or medication if you have someone who needs it to weather 3 days, 3 weeks, whatever your downtime tolerance could be once you start looking into this. And that's
why they tell you to put your mask on before helping others, right?
Yeah, I'm terrible at taking that advice, but it can be very hard for you to assist in emergency response as a volunteer fireman when your house is on fire. You're going to say, screw the town, I'm taking care of my kids. So these are things like getting life straws, digging a well, having a rain barrel, iodine tablets, buy some of that camping equipment you wanted, right? Not that I want you to have to camp indefinitely, but this could be a short disruption. If your town is quick to repair, it could be a very long disruption. So we have some advice for how to make sure your household is stable enough for you to be helpful to your community. Once you believe you've done that, we are building and have some already, but we have some and we're building more resources for ways you can lawfully try to assist your local community and Socratically ask questions. Playbooks that have worked elsewhere, so you don't have to be the author of the script. You just have to tailor it to your own style. So we encourage people to start to go to a town planning meeting, see how they think and talk. Yep. Don't talk yet, but just go observe one. One of the assignments out of B-Sides Las Vegas was the Mr. Rogers protocol of go and strike up a conversation with one of your neighbors and see how they react to it, what questions they ask. Maybe family members are the same. So there's things you can do for home which enable you to do things for your community. Immediately, though, there is something called the Cyber Resilience Corps, CORPS, that I'm helping with. It's a lot of Craig's grantees, including Berkeley's Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, Cyber Peace Builders, where if you already have a volunteer mobilization group, initially this is just a menu of menus where you can see, I need help on something. Let me see who has volunteers that I can ask in my region for my topic. Most of them are not cyber physical systems, critical infrastructure currently, but we're trying to get more of them to add themselves to this menu and separately give a generic intake that says, I live here, I'm willing to help, and you'll be able to see in your state or geography what the laws are. Because sometimes in Michigan Cyber Corps of Engineer, the Michigan Cyber Corps has been doing this for a while. They have a safe way to do this lawfully. In Wisconsin, it's under the National Guard's authority. In different states, you might get attacked for trying to help, right? So there's good Samaritan laws some places.
Yeah, right.
And we're trying to create a more consistent experience, both for volunteers, like hopefully your listeners, and for people who are, if I'm going to generate demand for help on tabletops or INL's consequence-informed engineering, Socratic questioning, then I want people like your listeners to be able to engage your local community to guide them through that or connect them to CISA-free resources or things like that. So there's a cyber resilience core. You can get directly involved with Undisruptible. We mostly organize in Slack, and you can request that at the page undisruptible27.org. But there's hopefully by the time people listen to this, and certainly hopefully after June, there'll be more clearer ways to get directly engaged. We have a big conference coming up. Craig has one called Cyber Civil Defense Summit on June 11th in DC. That was pre-existing. And then Bryson Bort and I have repurposed what used to be called Hack the Capital, and its brand new conference name is criticaleffect.org, critical-effect.org, where it's cyber physical systems owners and operators, but with a heavy focus on water, power, food, and access to emergency care, especially down market, target-rich cyber poor. There'll be some Congress people from both sides of the aisle, and quite a bit of urgency this time. So instead of talking about what we should do in 10 years, we're looking at what can be done in the next 12 to 24 months. So there's a couple different ways to get involved. We want to help the helpers be helpful. And then clearly after we've done your household and your community, we have some other campaigns in the works to try to get the most we can out of our state and federal partnerships. I hope things have stabilized by then and we know which services are still active and which ones are not. And that is a section of my talk I spent quite a bit of time on with all the things we've recently lost. But some things might be coming back shortly. They were accidents. And by then, we'll also be able to maybe put more pressure on our elected officials to do something.
All right, last one. What's next for Undisruptible 27? What's coming up in your calendar? What are your milestones? What are you going to do for the next 600 days?
Well, we're on the cusp of finishing our first year's pilot, so I'm actively negotiating what is and isn't funded for the long haul. But we have asked for a pretty sizable package to go through the most dangerous period in 2027. We've had to beef it up to not just do an information gap, but a motivation and enablement gap, Phil. We're going to need a few of you to be nominating your towns to be an active on-the-ground pilot, and we're going to go deep, roll up our sleeves, and get some stuff done. So it's going to be a lot tougher in phase 2, and we'll reveal more of those details probably at Critical Effect June 12th and 13th. Certainly by B-Sides Las Vegas. We hope to have a pretty big splash in our cavalry track for B-Sides Las Vegas in August. And we really need help learning how to talk to muggles, everyday Americans. Can't use policy speak, can't use jargon from the industry. I think in your heart, you know what's really most important for public safety. We just haven't really been conditioned to think about that. We look at where we have been attacked and by whom and why. And we have a real blind spot to the things that could really bring us to our knees. And you are the talent pool we have. We only have one of them. And I mostly just want to get your attention, and I thank you for hosting me here to try to get some people's attention, because we aren't powerless here. We just haven't been focused. And I don't need all your time. I just need some pro bono time to make sure that your family and your community are not as disrupted as they otherwise would have been. These are really scary problems if we leave things as is. There's some pleasantly surprised to see some really easy low-hanging fruit from an engineering perspective to make sure that the worst punch they can throw, we can take it. And I encourage people to get involved, push past your cynicism a little, push past your day job, muscle memory, to say, how do we become less dependent on undependable things for now? And in the aftermath, we're going to have to start pushing much harder for more trust and transparency and accountability, things like liability once and for all, and things like minimum safety standards once and for all. We've treated this like it's not a public safety human life issue. It is absolutely a public safety human life issue. And when it comes out, please watch the recording of War Games 2027 from RSA, because I really challenged the audience and they really took it in stride. It was a nice balance of really tough love, but also like undeniable recognition. And I hope that we cause that for you as well.
Well, thanks for coming, Josh. This is obviously critically important information, and if there's anything else I could do to help you with your project, let me know. I will start looking into what I could do in my local community, and I will share whatever resources you have available with my audience.
Start with your own household. I swear, your own creativity and brain will start kicking in.
I actually brought life straws for Christmas for everybody, but everybody's talking last year and I had to explain why is Dad getting us life straws?
Well, there's a difference between being a prepper and being prepared, and when someone tells you they're going to punch you hard, you should probably be prepared, right?
All right. Thanks, Josh. Take care. Good luck. We need it. And again, let me know if there's anything we can do in the future to help you.
Thank you.
So after we've talked about this, I think you can at least understand why I gave it the introduction I did. But I've got some follow-up thoughts that I wanted to give here. And that is, again, that this threat is real. And it has the potential to be catastrophic. And now I'm not saying it will happen. Nobody can predict the future. And if recent history has taught us anything, it's that crazy and consequential surprises can and do happen that just upset the apple cart, and we don't, it's hard to predict. But this threat is not theoretical. Our infrastructure already has been successfully hacked. And our top leaders have told us publicly under oath and clear in certain terms that they believe these attacks were designed to keep us on the sidelines so that China could invade Taiwan in, possibly as early as 2027. And that number was not picked out of the air. There's intelligence around why we believe, with good possibility, when China may be currently planning to try to pull this off. But okay, even if that particular scenario doesn't seem likely to you, or if you think, no, they'll never do it, the mere fact that the scenario is possible, because our critical infrastructure is woefully fragile and vulnerable to remote attack, should motivate us, individually and collectively, to improve our resilience, if not to become secure, to at least become undisruptible. As Josh put it, to be able to take that punch and survive and move on. And to take it even a step further, it doesn't even need to be an attack, right? I mean, look at the recent massive power outage that recently hit Spain and Portugal. They're still looking into it. We don't, at this point, I think, have an official answer for what happened, but I've seen some reports of what they think it might be. And it just seems to be a series of unfortunate and unlikely events. But nevertheless, it showed that the system wasn't resilient. Oh, and Josh mentioned the thermal exhaust port, and that wasn't a literal one. If you missed the reference, it was talking about the plot to the original Star Wars movie, where the Death Star had a fatal flaw that allowed it to be destroyed by a single well-placed proton torpedo, which is not to be confused with photon torpedoes. That's a Star Trek thing, which actually, by the way, reminds me that in a lot of cases when we're doing planning, trying to do tabletop exercises or trying to map out our responses to potential incidents, we actually bring in fiction writers. Sometimes we actually talked about with this Josh, I believe, in one of our previous interviews, because they are really good with coming up with some great ideas. I did want to mention real quick some books you might want to check out. We talked about Ghost Fleet. Josh seemed to think that there was a link to get that for free. If I can find that, I will definitely put that in the show notes. Also, the book called World War Z by Max Brooks. Ostensibly, it's about recovering from a zombie apocalypse, but he actually said that it's a fiction book about nonfiction circumstances. He was really trying to help us look at responding to other types of threats. Real threats. And then I personally like the book 1 Second After by William R. Fortune. I think is how you pronounce it. Forstchen. There's actually, I think, 4 books in that series now, and I've only read the first one. But if you want to feel more inspired or, kind of take a fiction writer's view of the potential outcomes from some of these sorts of attacks, these books will definitely drive that home. And they are entertaining reads as well. So maybe put 1 or 2 of those on your summer reading list. So please check the show notes for lots of helpful resources. I tried to provide links to as many of the things we discussed today as I could, at least the most useful ones. So definitely look at the show notes if you want further info. And one more thing, just kind of as an aside, if you're interested in ham radio or newer tech like Meshtastic, they can be really fun hobbies, but they're also very helpful for emergency communications, or MCOMs, when the primary systems are down or overwhelmed. So these can be fun kind of hobby things that also could pay off in times of emergency. So as usual, the patrons will get some bonus content on Thursday. It'll be, of course, more Q&A with Josh. We go a little bit deeper on some of the things we already talked about today. I asked him what his opinion was of a lot of the shakeups going down right now in the federal government in terms of laying off a lot of people in some of our key federal security agencies and what impacts that may have. And we just generally drill a little bit deeper into some of the subjects we already talked about. And then next week, we'll get back into our usual news and interview cadence. I know the topic today was pretty heavy, and it is absolutely important. But, you know, all the other stuff we discuss is also important. It's just different. So we will keep you posted on what's going on with Josh and his campaign. And, you know, I will, as things come up, I'll sprinkle in some reminders and maybe even some calls to action around the topic from time to time as that warrants. But, you know, we're going to go back to talking about all the things we normally talk about. And we've got some great stuff coming up. So after next week's news show, we'll be talking with Carl Dong, who's the founder of a very interesting new VPN company. And it's a new kind of VPN technology that I think has a lot of promise. We'll finally be getting to my interview with Debbie Reynolds and the ShmooCon founders and several others that I've got waiting in the wings, sitting on my hard drive, waiting to bring out to you guys. We got plenty of great guests and topics coming up throughout the summer. So I know we're running long, so let me just stop here. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.